In the early mornings, before the town had fully risen into its quiet routines of mailboxes opening and closing, coffee brewing behind curtained windows, and the distant low hum of passing traffic, Margaret Hale found herself sitting at the small kitchen table that had, over the years, come to feel less like a piece of furniture and more like a witness, one that had observed, without judgment, the slow accumulation of a shared life. The table bore marks she could trace with her fingertips, faint scratches from utensils, a pale ring where Thomas had once set down a glass without a coaster, the subtle dullness of wood polished too often in an attempt to preserve what could not, in truth, be preserved. It had been a year since his death, and yet she still found herself aligning her cup with the place where his had always been, as though the act itself carried a kind of quiet obligation. Outside, the street stretched in a straight, unremarkable line, Maple Street, though there were no maples left now, only a few aging oaks that leaned slightly, as if tired of holding themselves upright. The houses, similar in their modest design, held histories that rarely revealed themselves, and Margaret had long ago learned that people, like homes, concealed far more than they displayed. She had lived in this house for 46 years. The number seemed less like a measurement of time and more like an accumulation of gestures. Meals prepared, beds made, arguments softened before they could fully form, silences endured rather than questioned. Thomas had been a man of steadiness, which she had once believed to be the same as strength. He had worked at the insurance office downtown, returning each evening at nearly the same hour, his coat carrying the faint scent of paper and dust, a smell she had come to associate with reliability. She had loved him, or at least, she had lived within the shape of that love so completely that it had become indistinguishable from the structure of her days. Now in the mornings, the house seemed to hesitate, as though unsure how to proceed without him. Even the refrigerator's low hum felt more pronounced, and the ticking of the clock on the wall, an object she had never noticed with any particular attention, now pressed itself into her awareness with a persistence that bordered on accusation. It was on one such morning, with the pale light just beginning to settle along the edges of the kitchen counter, that she heard it. At first, it was only a distant vibration, indistinct enough to be mistaken for something else. A truck, perhaps, or the shifting of heavy equipment somewhere beyond the highway. But then it grew sharper, more defined, until it revealed itself unmistakably, the sound of a motorcycle. It passed quickly, the engine rising and then fading, leaving behind a peculiar stillness that felt less like silence and more like absence. Margaret did not move at first. She kept her hands folded around her cup, the heat of it barely registering against her skin, and listened as though something might return. But nothing did, and yet the sound remained, not in the air, but somewhere within her, as though it had struck a surface she had not known existed. She stood, slowly, and moved to the window. The street was empty. A thin breeze lifted the edges of fallen leaves along the curb, carrying them a few inches before letting them settle again. It was, she told herself, nothing. Just a motorcycle. There were more of them now than there used to be. She had seen them occasionally at the gas station near the highway, men mostly, though not always, wearing jackets that seemed too heavy for the season. their movements deliberate, contained, and yet, as she stood there, her hand resting lightly against the frame of the window, she found that the sound had already begun to shift in her memory, to detach itself from the present and attach, instead, to something else, something older, less defined. She turned away from the window, unsettled not by the memory itself, but by the fact that it had come so quickly, so uninvited. Later that morning she drove to the grocery store, taking the familiar route past the post office and the small park where the benches had recently been repainted a shade of green that felt, to her, unnecessarily bright. The parking lot was half full, and she parked in her usual spot, though she could not have said why it mattered. Inside, the store carried the same arrangement it always had. Produce to the left, dairy at the back, canned goods in long, orderly rows that suggested a kind of permanence the world outside did not possess. Margaret moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, selecting items without much thought, guided more by habit than by need. It was near the checkout that she saw her sister Judith. Judith Clark stood with a posture that had not changed in decades, upright, composed, her hair still arranged with a precision that suggested careful attention rather than vanity. She had been the eldest of the four sisters, and she carried that role with a subtle authority that Margaret had never entirely questioned, even now. "Margaret," Judith said, as though the encounter had been anticipated. "Judith," Margaret replied, offering a small nod. They stood for a moment, neither quite stepping closer nor retreating, as though the space between them required careful negotiation. "I was going to call you," Judith said. "I spoke with Eleanor yesterday." Margaret felt, at the mention of Eleanor's name, a slight tightening in her chest. Not unpleasant, but not entirely comfortable either. Eleanor Whitman, the youngest, had always existed at a distance, not only geographically, but in a way that was more difficult to define. "She's coming into town next week," Judith continued. "For a few days," Margaret nodded. "That will be good." Judith studied her for a moment, her gaze steady, searching perhaps for something that Margaret was not aware she was supposed to provide. "And you?" Judith asked. "How are you managing?" The question was asked with care, but it carried with it an expectation, an assumption that there was, in fact, something to be managed. "I'm all right," Margaret said. It was not untrue, though it was also not entirely accurate. But she had long ago learned that accuracy, in such matters, often served no useful purpose. Judith seemed to consider this, then nodded once, as though accepting an answer she had already anticipated. "We should all have dinner," she said, "while Eleanor is here. It's been too long." Margaret agreed, though she could not recall precisely when they had last all been together in the same room. Time, in families, had a way of compressing itself, of folding years into something that felt both immediate and distant. As they parted, Margaret found herself thinking not of the upcoming dinner, but of the sound she had heard that morning. It returned now unexpectedly, threading itself through her thoughts with a persistence that felt disproportionate to its brief existence. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal, something she no longer took much care with, given that there was no one to share it, she found herself pausing, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, as a memory began to take shape. It was not yet fully formed, not yet something she could examine directly. It existed instead, at the edge of her awareness, like a figure seen from a distance, recognizable, but not yet distinct. She did not, at that moment, allow herself to follow it. Instead, she turned back to the stove, stirring the contents of the pot with a deliberate attention that felt, in its way, like an act of restraint. But later, as she sat alone in the living room, the television on but unwatched, she realized that the memory had not receded. It had only been waiting. The photograph was not something she had intended to find. It appeared, instead, as a consequence of a task she had delayed for months, the sorting of Thomas's belongings, which had remained, until recently, largely untouched, as though their continued presence might somehow preserve the shape of his absence. The closet in the hallway had been his domain, though in truth it had held very little that could be described as personal. His coats hung in a neat row, each one bearing the faint imprint of his shoulders, and on the upper shelf were several boxes, their contents indistinct until examined. Margaret had approached the task with a quiet determination that felt less like resolve and more like necessity. There were practical reasons, of course, space to be cleared, items to be donated. But beneath those reasons lay something less easily articulated. She began with the boxes. Inside the first, she found documents, tax returns, insurance papers, receipts carefully folded and dated. Thomas had been meticulous in such matters, and as she sorted through them, she felt a familiar mixture of gratitude and distance, as though she were handling the remnants of a life that had been both shared and, in certain ways, separate. The second box contained photographs. They were arranged loosely, not in albums but in small stacks, as though they had once been organized and then, over time, allowed to drift into a more casual order. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the box resting beside her, and began to look through them. There were the expected images, holidays, birthdays, the four sisters standing together at various points in their lives, their expressions shifting subtly from year to year as time left its quiet marks. There were photographs of Thomas at different ages, though even in the earliest ones he appeared much the same, composed, slightly reserved, his smile present but restrained. She paused over one photograph in particular. It showed her and Thomas on their wedding day. She remembered the dress, not the fabric or the details, but the sensation of wearing it, the way it had felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. Her expression in the photograph was difficult to interpret. There was no overt joy, but neither was there hesitation. It was, she thought, the expression of someone stepping into a role she had already accepted. She set the photograph aside and continued. It was near the bottom of the box that she found it. At first, she did not recognize it as anything significant. The image was slightly faded, the edges worn in a way that suggested it had once been handled more frequently than the others. It showed a road, long, stretching into the distance, bordered by fields that appeared, even in the photograph, to be in motion, as though the wind had been captured along with the image. And then, in the foreground, there was a figure, a young woman, seated on the back of a motorcycle. For a moment, Margaret did not understand what she was seeing. The image seemed disconnected from the rest of the photographs, as though it belonged to a different collection, a different life. But then she saw it. The angle of the head, the line of the shoulders, the way the hands rested, lightly, almost uncertainly, against the sides of the seat. It was her. She felt, rather than thought, the recognition. It moved through her with a quiet force, unsettling in its immediacy. The memory, which had lingered at the edge of her awareness since that morning, now stepped forward with a clarity that left little room for avoidance. It had been summer. She could not recall the exact year, though she knew it had been before Thomas, before the structure of her life had settled into its familiar form. She had been younger than she felt in the photograph, no more than 20, perhaps 21. The motorcycle had belonged to a man whose name she struggled, at first, to remember. Then it came to her. Daniel Avery. He had not been part of her life for long. In fact, when she tried to measure the duration of their acquaintance, she found that it resisted such measurement. It had been, in every sense, brief. And yet, she could recall the first time she saw him standing near the edge of a parking lot, the motorcycle beside him, its presence at once ordinary and entirely distinct from the surroundings. There had been nothing particularly remarkable about him, no striking features, no immediate indication that he would become significant. But there had been something else, a way of standing perhaps, or a manner of looking at the world that suggested it was not fixed, not predetermined. She had spoken to him only a few times before he asked her to ride with him. Even now, the memory of that moment carried a faint echo of disbelief, not at the invitation itself, but at her own response. She had said yes. The ride had been brief, no more than an hour, perhaps less. And yet within that hour something had shifted, something she had not fully understood at the time, and perhaps still did not. She remembered the sensation first, the movement of the motorcycle beneath her, the way it seemed to respond not only to the road but to something more immediate, more instinctive. The wind had pressed against her, not harshly, but with a kind of insistence that made it impossible to remain entirely within herself. She had been aware of her body in a way that felt both unfamiliar and entirely natural. The balance required, the subtle adjustments, the constant awareness of motion. And beneath it all there had been a feeling she had not known how to name. Freedom, perhaps, though even now the word felt insufficient. When the ride ended, she had stepped off the motorcycle with a sense that something had been opened, though she could not have said what. She saw Daniel only once more after that. There had been no argument, no clear ending. He had simply continued on, as people sometimes do, following paths that do not intersect again. And she had returned to her life. Margaret sat on the bed, the photograph resting in her hands, and felt the distance between that moment and the present, not as a line, but as a series of choices, some deliberate, others less so. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had built together, of the years that had passed with a steadiness that had once seemed both comforting and sufficient. And then quietly, almost without intention, a question formed, not loud, not insistent, but present in a way that could not be dismissed. What if she had chosen differently? She did not, at first, attempt to answer it. Instead, she placed the photograph on the bed beside her and sat very still, as though any movement might disrupt something that had only just begun to take shape. Outside, a car passed, its tires moving softly along the pavement, and in the distance, faint but unmistakable, she thought she heard it again, the low rising sound of a motorcycle threading its way through the quiet afternoon. In the days that followed, the photograph did not return to the box. Margaret placed it, at first without much deliberation, on the small desk in the living room where Thomas had once kept his checkbook and a narrow leather-bound calendar that still lay open to a week in late autumn, his handwriting ending mid-line, as though he had simply paused and intended to resume. The photograph rested beside it, slightly askew, its presence both incongruous and quietly insistent. She found herself glancing at it at odd moments, when passing through the room, when adjusting the curtains in the late afternoon, when standing, inexplicably, without purpose. Each time the image seemed to offer something different, not in its content but in the way it aligned itself with her thoughts, as though it were less an object than a question that shifted depending on how it was approached. The young woman in the photograph, herself, and yet not entirely, appeared unburdened by the considerations that now shaped Margaret's movements. There was a lightness in the posture, a subtle forward inclination, as though she were already leaning into something not yet visible. Margaret did not, at first, dwell on the man whose presence was implied but not shown. Daniel Avery existed in her memory as a series of impressions rather than a fully formed figure. She could recall the sound of his voice more readily than the exact features of his face, the cadence of his speech suggesting an ease that had both intrigued and unsettled her. It was not him, she realized, who had remained. It was the feeling. On Thursday, she drove to see her sister Ruth. Ruth lived on the outskirts of town, in a house that had once belonged to her husband's parents and now carried, in its arrangement and atmosphere, the layered presence of multiple generations. The yard was well kept, though not with the careful precision Judith favored. Rather, it bore the marks of continual attention, of tasks performed not for appearance, but out of habit. Margaret parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment before stepping out, listening to the faint crunch of the stones beneath her tires as they settled. The air held the lingering coolness of early spring, and somewhere nearby a dog barked once, then fell silent. Ruth opened the door before Margaret reached it. "You didn't call," Ruth said, though there was no reproach in her voice, only a statement, offered with the mild surprise of someone accustomed to patterns that had not been followed. "I was already out," Margaret replied, which was not entirely true. Ruth stepped aside to let her in. The interior of the house was warm, carrying the faint scent of something recently baked. On the kitchen counter, a loaf of bread rested beneath a cloth, and Margaret felt, with a sudden clarity, the difference between this house and her own, not in its size or arrangement, but in the way it seemed to be continually in use, as though it were never entirely at rest. "Sit," Ruth said, gesturing toward the table. "I'll make some tea." Margaret sat, folding her hands in her lap, and watched as Ruth moved about the kitchen with a practiced efficiency. There was something reassuring in these movements, in their familiarity, though Margaret could not have said precisely why. "How have you been?" Ruth asked without turning. "All right," Margaret said. Ruth nodded as though this answer had been expected. They sat together for some time, the conversation moving in small, careful increments. Neighbors, the condition of the road leading into town, the upcoming visit from Eleanor. It was only after the tea had been poured and the initial exchanges had settled into a quieter rhythm that Ruth looked at her more directly. "You've been thinking about something," Ruth said. Margaret felt at this a slight resistance, not to the observation itself, but to the ease with which it had been made. "I found an old photograph," she said after a moment. Ruth waited. "It was in one of Thomas's boxes," Margaret continued. "I don't know why it was there." "What kind of photograph?" Margaret hesitated, aware that the answer once spoken would shift something in the space between them. "It's from before," she said. "Before I met him." Ruth's expression did not change, though there was a subtle adjustment in her posture, a slight leaning forward that suggested attention rather than curiosity. "And?" Margaret considered how to describe it, and found that the image itself was easier to recall than the words required to convey its significance. "I was on a motorcycle," she said finally. Ruth blinked once, slowly. "You?" she asked, not with disbelief, but with a kind of careful reconsideration. "Yes." There was a brief silence, during which the ordinary sounds of the house, the ticking of a clock, the faint movement of air through the vents, seemed to assert themselves more clearly. "I don't remember that," Ruth said. "No," Margaret replied. "I don't think anyone does." Ruth studied her gaze steady but not intrusive. "And now you're thinking about it," she said. Margaret nodded. She did not, at that moment, speak of the feeling the memory had carried, or of the way it had begun to alter her sense of the present. These things felt, as yet, too indistinct, too easily diminished by articulation. Ruth leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the table. "Well," she said after a moment, "people remember things." It was not a dismissal, nor was it an encouragement. It was rather an acknowledgement, one that allowed for the possibility of significance without insisting upon it. Margaret felt, unexpectedly, a sense of relief. They spoke of other things after that, and when Margaret left, the photograph remained unmentioned, though not, she sensed, forgotten. As she drove home, the road stretched ahead of her in a familiar sequence of turns and straightaways, bordered by fields that had only just begun to show the first signs of new growth. The sky was pale, the light diffuse, and for a moment she found herself imagining, not consciously, but with a kind of quiet inevitability, what it would feel like to move through this space differently, not enclosed, not contained, but open to it. The thought passed, but not entirely. The decision, when it came, did not announce itself. It emerged instead in fragments, small adjustments in thought, moments of attention that lingered longer than they once would have, a gradual shift in the way Margaret moved through her days. It was not, she understood, a single moment of resolve, but the accumulation of many quieter ones. She began, without fully acknowledging that she had begun. It started with observation. At the edge of town, near the highway where the gas station stood, with its faded signage and the persistent smell of fuel that seemed to cling to the air regardless of the wind, there was a place where motorcycles occasionally gathered. Margaret had passed it countless times over the years without particular notice, registering it only as part of the landscape, no more significant than the row of vending machines or the small convenience store attached to it. Now she found herself slowing as she approached. The first time she did not stop. She simply reduced her speed enough to allow her gaze to linger, taking in the shapes and colors, the angled lines of the machines, the way they stood at rest yet suggested movement, the quiet presence of the people around them. There were 2 motorcycles that day, parked side by side, their surfaces reflecting the muted light. A man stood nearby, his hands moving in small, deliberate gestures as he spoke to another figure partially obscured by the pump. Margaret drove past, her attention held not by the people, but by the machines themselves. The next time she pulled into the lot, she told herself it was for gas, which was not untrue. But as she stepped out of the car, the air carrying the familiar mixture of fuel and dust, she felt a subtle awareness of her own presence, of the fact that she was there not entirely by accident. There was a motorcycle parked near the edge of the lot, separate from the others. It was smaller than she expected, its frame less imposing, its surface marked by use rather than display. The seat, worn in places, suggested a history of motion rather than preservation. She approached it slowly, not so much out of caution as out of a sense that proximity required a certain attentiveness. Up close, the details became more apparent. The texture of the grips, the slight irregularities in the metal, the way the light caught on the edges in a manner that emphasized both form and function. It was not, she realized, an object designed to be admired at a distance. It was meant to be used. First time looking at one that close. The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried. Margaret turned. The man who stood a few feet away was older than she had expected, perhaps in his late 60s, though there was a quality to him that made age less easily defined. His posture was relaxed, his expression neither guarded nor overly open. "Yes," Margaret said. He nodded as though this answer fit easily into his understanding of the world. "They look different up close," he said. "They do." He stepped nearer, not intruding, but closing the distance enough that the conversation no longer required projection. "You ride?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "No," she said. Then, after a brief pause, "Not exactly." The man regarded her for a moment, his gaze steady but without pressure. "You thinking about it?" he asked. The question, simple as it was, seemed to settle into her with a weight she had not anticipated. It was not the first time the thought had occurred to her, but it was the first time it had been spoken aloud, given a form that required acknowledgement. "I don't know," she said. He nodded again, as though uncertainty were not only expected, but appropriate. "Well," he said, gesturing lightly toward the motorcycle, "it's not as complicated as it looks, but it's not nothing either." Margaret felt at this a flicker of something, interest perhaps, though it carried with it a trace of apprehension. "I'm 70, she said, the statement emerging more directly than she intended. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet assessment that seemed to take into account not only the number, but the person who spoke it. "And?" he said. Margaret felt unexpectedly a slight shift within herself, not a dismissal of the fact, but a reconfiguration of its meaning. "I've never done anything like that," she said. The man smiled, though it was not a broad or performative expression. It was rather a small adjustment, as though something in her words had aligned with his understanding. "Everyone hasn't," he said, "until they do." There was a pause during which the sounds of the gas station, the distant movement of cars, the intermittent click of pumps, seemed to recede. "My name's Walter," he added. "Margaret." He nodded. "Well, Margaret," he said, "if you decide you want to try, there's a place a few miles out. They teach people, all kinds." Margaret felt the word settle into her, not as a directive, but as a possibility, one that did not demand immediate action, but would not, she sensed, easily disappear. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. Walter inclined his head slightly, then stepped back, allowing the space between them to return. Margaret stood for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the motorcycle, its presence now altered by the conversation, by the fact that it was no longer entirely external to her. Then she turned, walked back to her car, and drove away. But as she merged onto the road, the landscape unfolding ahead of her in its familiar sequence, she realized that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily named, but enough. In the evenings, Margaret found that the house no longer settled into silence in the same way it once had. The quiet, which had initially pressed against her with a kind of weight she could not escape, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to change its character. It was still there, still present in the spaces between sounds, but it no longer felt entirely empty. Instead, it carried something else, something less definable, as though it were waiting. She did not speak of the encounter at the gas station to anyone, not to Judith, who would have responded with a measured concern that would quickly become instruction, not to Ruth, whose quiet acceptance might have made the matter feel too real, and certainly not to Eleanor, whose distance had always rendered her reactions unpredictable, shaped by a life Margaret only partially understood. And yet, the thought remained. It surfaced at unexpected moments, while folding laundry, while rinsing a cup at the sink, while standing at the window in the late afternoon when the light stretched across the floor in long, angled lines that seemed to divide the room into sections of past and present. Each time the thought was not fully formed. It did not present itself as a plan, or even as a desire. It was rather a question that lingered just beyond articulation. What would it mean? She found herself returning, in fragments, to the memory of that single ride so many years ago, not in a nostalgic sense, but with a kind of analytical attention that surprised her. She examined it, as one might examine an object long kept but rarely used, turning it over in her mind to understand not only what it had been, but why it had remained. It had not been the man. This realization came to her gradually, though once it arrived, it felt obvious. Daniel Avery had been in many ways incidental, not unimportant, but not central either. He had been the conduit, not the source. What she remembered most clearly was the sensation of movement, the way the world had altered when viewed not through a window, not from a position of separation, but from within it, immediate, unmediated. She had not, at the time, recognized it as something that could be chosen. It had felt like an interruption, a brief deviation from the expected course of her life, one that would naturally resolve itself by returning to what was familiar. And it had. She thought of Thomas then, not with regret, but with a kind of careful reconsideration. Their life together had not been devoid of contentment. There had been moments, quiet, understated moments, that had carried their own form of satisfaction. Shared meals, evenings spent in the same room without the need for conversation. The steady accumulation of years that had, in their own way, affirmed a kind of stability. But now, as she allowed herself to examine it more closely, she began to see the structure of that life not only in terms of what it had provided, but also in terms of what it had excluded. There had been no sudden decisions, no deviations that could not be accounted for, no moments in which she had stepped outside the boundaries of what was expected. She had not questioned this, or rather, she had not allowed herself to question it. One evening, as she sat in the living room, the photograph resting on the desk within her line of sight, she found herself rising without quite knowing why. She moved to the desk, picked up the photograph, and held it for a moment, her gaze tracing the faint outline of the road, the blurred suggestion of movement captured within the still image. Then, with a deliberation that felt both unfamiliar and entirely her own, she reached for the telephone. The number Walter had mentioned was not one she had written down, but she remembered the name of the place, a small training school located just beyond the edge of town, near a stretch of road she had driven past countless times without noticing. It took her a moment to find it in the directory. When she dialed, the sound of the ringing seemed unusually loud, as though it were marking not only the passage of time, but the crossing of something less visible. A voice answered, female, younger than she had expected, with a clarity that suggested attentiveness. "Ridgeway Motorcycle Training," the voice said. "How can I help you?" Margaret felt for a brief moment the impulse to hang up, not out of fear, but out of a sudden awareness that she was about to say something she had not yet fully accepted. "I'd like to ask about lessons," she said. There was no pause, no indication that the request was unusual. "Of course," the voice replied. "Have you ridden before?" Margaret hesitated. "Not really," she said. "That's fine," the voice said. "Most people haven't. We start with the basics." Margaret listened as the woman explained the structure of the lessons, the schedule, the requirements, the equipment. The information was presented in a straightforward manner, without embellishment, as though it were entirely ordinary, as though there were nothing remarkable about a 70-year-old woman calling to inquire about learning to ride a motorcycle. When the conversation ended, Margaret remained seated, the receiver still in her hand for a moment longer than necessary. She had not committed to anything, and yet something had already begun. The first time Margaret drove out to the training grounds, she did so under the pretense of observation. The road leading there diverged from the main highway in a way that made it easy to overlook, a narrow stretch of asphalt that curved gently before straightening into a long, open line, bordered by fields that had not yet fully recovered from winter. The land, in its muted tones, seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to emerge. She had driven past this road many times, always with the same vague awareness that it led somewhere she had no reason to go. Now, as she turned onto it, she felt a subtle shift, not in the landscape itself, but in her relation to it. The training grounds appeared gradually, not as a distinct destination, but as an extension of the road itself. A wide, open lot, marked by faded lines and a series of orange cones arranged in patterns that suggested intention, though not immediately purpose. At the far end stood a small building, its exterior plain, functional, with a single door and a narrow window that reflected the pale sky. There were several motorcycles lined up along one side of the lot. They were smaller than she had imagined, their proportions less imposing, their surfaces marked by use rather than display. A few people stood nearby, 2 younger men and a woman, their movements tentative, as though they were still learning how to occupy the space. Margaret parked at a distance. She remained in the car for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. There was no urgency in her presence, no expectation that she would step out immediately. She was, for now, simply observing. A figure emerged from the building. The woman who approached the group moved with a quiet assurance, her posture relaxed but attentive. She wore a jacket that appeared both practical and worn, and as she began to speak, her gestures were measured, deliberate. Margaret could not hear the words, but she could see the structure of the interaction, the way the others shifted their attention, the slight adjustments in their stance as they responded to instruction. One of the men mounted a motorcycle. The movement was awkward, his leg hesitating slightly before clearing the seat. The woman watched, then stepped closer, offering a correction that was conveyed not through visible insistence, but through a subtle repositioning, a guiding presence, rather than a directive one. Margaret felt, as she watched, a complex mixture of responses, curiosity certainly, but also something else, something less easily defined, recognition perhaps, not of the activity itself, but of the process, the gradual acquisition of something unfamiliar, the willingness to move through uncertainty toward a form of understanding that could not be fully explained in advance. She sat there longer than she intended. At some point, the woman looked up and saw her. There was no immediate reaction, no indication that Margaret's presence was unexpected. Instead, the woman offered a small nod, a gesture that acknowledged without questioning. Margaret hesitated, then opened the car door. The air was cooler than she had anticipated, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something metallic, perhaps from the motorcycles themselves. She walked slowly across the lot, aware of her steps in a way that felt both grounding and slightly disorienting. As she approached, the sounds became clearer, the low murmur of voices, the intermittent hum of engines starting and stopping, the soft scrape of tires against pavement. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice calm, direct. Margaret recognized it immediately. "I called yesterday," she said. "About lessons." The woman nodded. "Margaret," she said. "I remember." There was something in the way she said it, not familiarity exactly, but a recognition that carried no judgment, no surprise. "I'm Claire," she added. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Margaret said. Claire considered this, her expression unchanged. "But you did," she said. Margaret felt at this a slight shift, something aligning, though she could not have said precisely what. "I just wanted to see," she said. "That's how it usually starts," Claire replied. There was no encouragement in her tone, but neither was there dismissal. It was, Margaret realized, a statement of fact. Claire gestured lightly toward the lot. "You can watch," she said. "Or if you'd like, you can try sitting on one. No pressure." Margaret's gaze moved to the motorcycles, their presence now more immediate, less abstract. "Just sitting?" she asked. Claire nodded. "Just sitting." Margaret stood for a moment, her attention shifting between the machines and the people moving among them, each engaged in their own process of learning, of adjustment. Then, slowly, she walked toward the nearest motorcycle. Up close, it seemed both simpler and more complex than she had imagined. The lines were straightforward, the structure clear, and yet there was an underlying intricacy, a balance of elements that suggested a kind of precision she could not yet fully understand. She placed her hand on the seat. The surface was cool, the texture slightly worn. For a moment she did nothing more, allowing the contact itself to register. Then, with a careful movement, she lifted her leg and settled onto the seat. The position was unfamiliar. Her feet did not immediately find their place, and she adjusted, shifting slightly, until she felt a tentative sense of balance. The handlebars rested in front of her, their presence both inviting and distant. She did not start the engine. She did not move. She simply sat. And in that stillness she became aware of something she had not anticipated. Not a memory, not exactly, but an echo, a faint, almost imperceptible recognition that seemed to arise not from her thoughts, but from her body itself, as though something long dormant had been gently, quietly recalled. She remained there for only a minute, perhaps less. Then she stepped off, her movements careful, deliberate. Claire watched, her expression unchanged. "Well?" she asked. Margaret considered the question. "It's different than I expected," she said. Claire nodded. "It usually is." Margaret looked once more at the motorcycle, its presence now altered, not because it had changed, but because her relation to it had. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to try." The words, once spoken, did not feel as foreign as she had imagined. Claire's response was simple. "All right," she said. The first lesson was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, at an hour that Margaret would once have associated with errands. Grocery stores not yet crowded, the post office still quiet, the slow unfolding of a day that held no particular demands. Now, as she drove toward the training grounds, she felt an unfamiliar tension beneath the surface of her thoughts, not sharp or overwhelming, but persistent enough that she could not entirely ignore it. The sky was pale, the kind of light that seemed undecided, neither fully morning nor yet approaching afternoon. Along the roadside, the fields had begun to show faint traces of green, though much of the land still bore the muted tones of winter. It was a landscape she had known for decades, and yet, as she moved through it now, it seemed to present itself differently, not altered, but more immediate, as though it were no longer something she passed through, but something she was, in some small way, entering. There were already several people at the training grounds when she arrived. She recognized one of the younger men from her previous visit, his posture slightly stiff, as he stood beside a motorcycle, his attention fixed on the machine as though it might, at any moment, reveal something he had not yet understood. The woman was there as well, adjusting her gloves with a methodical precision that suggested both focus and uncertainty. Claire stood near the center of the lot, her presence quiet but anchoring, as though the space arranged itself around her without effort. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, as Margaret approached. "Good morning." There was no ceremony to the beginning of the lesson. Claire spoke briefly, outlining the basic elements: balance, control, awareness. Her words measured, practical, devoid of embellishment. Margaret listened, aware that much of what was being said would only become meaningful through experience. She was given a helmet, heavier than she expected, its weight settling onto her head with a solidity that felt both protective and slightly confining. The strap, once fastened, pressed lightly beneath her chin, a constant reminder of its presence. "Start with just walking it," Claire said, gesturing toward one of the smaller motorcycles. "No engine yet. Get a feel for the weight." Margaret approached the motorcycle with a deliberate care, her movements slower than she would have preferred, though she recognized that haste would serve no purpose here. She placed her hands on the handlebars, feeling the cool metal beneath her palms, and gently lifted the bike from its stand. The weight surprised her. It was not unmanageable, but it was substantial in a way that required attention. She adjusted her stance, shifting her balance, and began to walk it forward, her steps measured, her focus narrowing to the immediate interaction between her body and the machine. There was a moment, a brief, disorienting moment, when the motorcycle leaned slightly to one side, and she felt a flicker of panic, a sudden awareness of her own limitations. But then she corrected, her grip tightening, her body adjusting in a way that felt less like conscious control and more like instinct. "Good," Claire said somewhere nearby. "Keep it steady." Margaret continued, the movement becoming gradually less foreign. The initial tension did not disappear, but it softened, replaced by a kind of concentration that absorbed her attention entirely. Later, when she sat on the motorcycle and started the engine for the first time, the vibration startled her. It was immediate, physical, a low, continuous presence that moved through her hands, her arms, her entire body. She felt it not as a sound, but as a sensation, something alive beneath her, something that required not only control, but a form of cooperation she had not anticipated. "Easy on the throttle," Claire instructed, "just enough to move." Margaret twisted her wrist slightly. The motorcycle responded. The forward motion was small, tentative, but unmistakable. She felt in that moment a convergence of fear and something else, something that did not yet have a name, but that carried with it a faint echo of recognition. She moved a few feet, then stopped. Again. Each attempt was accompanied by a heightened awareness, not only of the machine, but of herself. The position of her hands, the angle of her feet, the subtle shifts in balance that determined whether the movement felt controlled or precarious. There were moments of awkwardness. Once, she stalled the engine and felt a flush of embarrassment rise unexpectedly, as though she had revealed something she would have preferred to keep concealed. Another time, she misjudged the pressure on the throttle, and the motorcycle lurched slightly forward, prompting a quick correction that left her heart beating faster than she would have liked. But there were also moments, brief, almost fleeting, when the movement aligned, when the machine responded as she intended, when her body adjusted without conscious instruction, when the space between thought and action seemed to narrow. It was in one of these moments that she felt it again, not as memory, but as something present, a sense of being fully within the experience, not observing it, not evaluating it, but inhabiting it in a way that felt both unfamiliar and deeply, quietly right. The lesson ended without ceremony. Claire gathered them together, offering a few final observations, her tone consistent, her attention evenly distributed. There was no praise, no criticism that lingered beyond its usefulness. As Margaret removed her helmet, she became aware of the weight lifting from her head, of the air against her skin, of the slight dampness at her temples. "How do you feel?" Claire asked. Margaret considered the question. "Tired," she said. Claire nodded. "That's normal." Margaret hesitated, then added, "And something else." Claire's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. "It usually is," she said. Margaret drove home with a heightened awareness of her body, of the way her hands rested on the steering wheel, of the subtle movements required to guide the car along the road. The landscape, though unchanged, seemed to hold a different quality, as though it had been brought into sharper focus. That evening, as she sat in the living room, the photograph on the desk before her, she realized that the memory it held no longer existed in isolation. It had begun to connect, not as a return to the past, but as a continuation. Eleanor arrived on a Thursday afternoon, her car pulling into Judith's driveway with a precision that suggested long practice rather than urgency. Margaret had arrived earlier, at Judith's insistence, and was seated in the living room when she heard the sound of the engine cutting off, followed by the quiet closing of the car door. Judith stood at the window, her posture composed, her gaze directed outward. "She's here," she said, though it was unnecessary. Margaret rose, smoothing the front of her sweater in a gesture that felt automatic, as though it belonged to a version of herself that had not entirely receded. Eleanor entered without knocking. She carried herself with a confidence that had, over the years, become more pronounced, though not necessarily more accessible. Her movements were efficient, her expression composed in a way that suggested both awareness and distance. "Margaret," she said, stepping forward and embracing her lightly. "Eleanor." The embrace was brief, but not perfunctory. It carried within its restraint a recognition of time past, of shared history that required no elaboration. Judith approached next, their greeting similarly measured, their familiarity expressed not through overt emotion, but through the absence of hesitation. They settled into the living room, the three of them arranged in a configuration that felt, to Margaret, both familiar and subtly altered. The space between them held the weight of years, of conversations had and avoided, of understandings that had never been fully articulated. "You look well," Eleanor said, her gaze resting on Margaret with a directness that felt both attentive and evaluative. "I'm all right," Margaret replied. Eleanor nodded, as though this answer aligned with her expectations. "And you?" Margaret asked. "Busy," Eleanor said, "which is how I prefer it." There was a slight emphasis on the final words, a suggestion that preference for Eleanor had always been something asserted rather than discovered. They spoke at first of practical matters, travel, the condition of Judith's house, the arrangements for dinner. The conversation moved with a certain ease, though beneath it Margaret sensed the presence of other, unspoken topics, waiting for an opening that might or might not come. It was Judith who introduced it. "Margaret's been doing something new," she said, her tone neutral, though not entirely without intention. Margaret felt at this a subtle tightening, not of discomfort exactly, but of awareness. Eleanor's gaze shifted. "Oh?" she said. Margaret hesitated, aware that the words, once spoken, would not easily be contained. "I've started taking motorcycle lessons," she said. There was a brief silence, not long enough to be overt, but sufficient to register. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. "Motorcycle lessons," she repeated. "Yes." Judith remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her attention fixed not on Margaret, but on a point somewhere between them. Eleanor studied her. "And what brought that on?" she asked. The question was direct but not dismissive. It carried instead a kind of measured curiosity, as though she were assessing not only the action, but the reasoning behind it. Margaret considered her response. "I found an old photograph," she said, "from when I was younger." Eleanor waited. "I was on a motorcycle," Margaret continued. "I had forgotten about it." Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, though the change was subtle. "And now you remember," she said. "Yes." There was a pause. "And you decided," Eleanor said, "that this was something you wanted to revisit." Margaret felt, in the phrasing, a faint implication, not of criticism, but of distance, as though the decision existed outside a framework Eleanor recognized. "I wanted to see what it was," Margaret said. What was?" Margaret hesitated. "Not just the memory," she said. "The feeling." The word, once spoken, seemed insufficient, but she did not attempt to replace it. Eleanor was silent for a moment. "And?" she asked. Margaret thought of the lessons, of the vibration of the engine, of the moments when movement and intention had aligned. "It's not the same," she said. Judith shifted slightly, her attention sharpening. "In what way?" Eleanor asked. Margaret searched for the words. "It's harder," she said, "and clearer." Eleanor considered this, her gaze steady. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose that's true of most things." The conversation moved on after that, though not entirely away. The subject lingered at the edges, returning in small ways, questions about the lessons, about the instructor, about how long Margaret intended to continue. Ruth arrived later, completing the circle. When she heard, she did not react immediately. Instead, she looked at Margaret with a quiet attentiveness, as though she were listening not only to what had been said, but to something beneath it. "That sounds like you," she said eventually. Margaret felt at this a slight surprise. "It does?" she asked. Ruth nodded. "It always did," she said. Margaret did not respond. But later, as she sat among her sisters, the conversation flowing around her in familiar patterns, she found herself considering Ruth's words, not as a statement of fact, but as a possibility, one she had not, until now, allowed herself to see. In the days following Eleanor's visit, Margaret found that her routine had acquired a new, almost imperceptible center. It did not replace what had come before. Her mornings at the kitchen table, the quiet errands, the measured unfolding of hours, but it altered their arrangement, as though something had been inserted into the structure of her days that shifted their balance. The lessons continued. She attended them with a consistency that surprised her, not because of the effort required, but because of the attention they demanded. It was not possible, she discovered, to approach them casually. Each movement required presence. Each adjustment, however small, carried consequences that could not be ignored. Her body, at first resistant, began to respond in ways that felt both unfamiliar and quietly encouraging. The stiffness in her shoulders lessened, though it did not disappear. Her hands, which had initially gripped the handlebars with a tension she could feel even after she had stepped away, gradually learned a different kind of contact, firmer where necessary, but not rigid. There were setbacks. One morning, as she attempted a slow turn around a series of cones, she misjudged the angle and brought the motorcycle too sharply to one side. The imbalance came quickly, and before she could fully correct it, the bike tipped, its weight pulling her with it. She did not fall hard. Claire was there almost immediately, steadying the motorcycle, guiding it upright with a practiced ease that made the incident seem, if not insignificant, then at least manageable. "Are you all right?" Claire asked. Margaret nodded, though her heart was beating faster than she would have liked. "Yes." There was a brief pause, during which Claire looked at her, not with concern, but with a kind of quiet evaluation. "It happens," she said. Margaret brushed her hands lightly against her pants, as though removing something that was not entirely visible. "I know," she said. But the knowledge did not entirely diminish the sensation, the sudden loss of control, the awareness of her body's limitations, the brief but unmistakable recognition that she was not, and would not be, as capable as she might once have been. The rest of the lesson proceeded without incident, though Margaret felt beneath her movements a residual hesitation. It did not prevent her from continuing, but it altered the quality of her attention, introducing a caution that bordered at times on restraint. Afterward, as she removed her helmet, Claire approached. "You're thinking too much," she said. Margaret gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I've always done that." Claire nodded. "That works in some situations," she said. "Not so much here." Margaret considered this. "How do you stop?" she asked. Claire shrugged slightly. "You don't stop thinking," she said. "You just don't let it get ahead of what you're doing." The distinction, though subtle, lingered with Margaret as she drove home. That afternoon she found herself standing in the hallway, the closet door open, the boxes still partially unpacked. She had not returned to them since finding the photograph, though their presence had remained in her awareness, a quiet reminder of something incomplete. She reached for another box. Inside, she found letters. They were bundled together with a thin ribbon, their edges yellowed, the paper carrying the faint scent of age that seemed to exist beyond any specific source. She sat on the floor, the box beside her, and untied the ribbon with a care that felt disproportionate to the simplicity of the action. The first letter she opened was from Thomas. The handwriting was familiar, though less steady than she remembered. The lines slightly uneven, as though written in haste, or under a condition that had not allowed for his usual precision. She read it slowly. It was not dated, though the content suggested a time early in their marriage, He wrote of work, of small frustrations, of his intention to provide, to ensure that their life would be stable, secure. There was affection in the words, though it was expressed in a manner consistent with his nature, measured, understated, without flourish. Margaret set the letter aside and reached for another. This one was different. The handwriting was not Thomas's. It was looser, less controlled, the lines varying in pressure, as though the act of writing had been guided more by impulse than by intention. She felt, before she read it, a faint unease, not fear exactly, but a recognition that this letter did not belong to the same category as the others. She unfolded it. The name at the bottom was familiar. Daniel. She sat very still. The letter was brief. He wrote of leaving, of traveling further than he had initially planned, of roads that extended beyond what he had imagined. There was no expectation in his words, no request that she join him, no suggestion that she should have chosen differently. But there was something else, a line near the end that held her attention. You felt it too. I could tell. Some people don't let themselves keep that. Margaret read the sentence again, then again. There was no accusation in it, no overt implication. And yet, as she sat there, the letter resting in her hands, she felt a subtle shift, not in her memory of the past, but in her understanding of it. Had she known? At the time, she had not considered the experience in terms that required preservation. It had been to her a moment, distinct, certainly, but not necessarily formative in a way that demanded action. She had not thought of it as something that could be kept. Now, as she folded the letter and placed it beside the others, she found herself reconsidering not only that moment, but the sequence of decisions that had followed, not with regret, but with a clarity that felt, in some ways, more unsettling. The weather shifted in early April, bringing with it a series of days that seemed to exist in a state of transition. The air warmed, though not consistently. The light lingered longer in the evenings, though it carried with it a softness that suggested impermanence. Margaret continued her lessons. The initial unfamiliarity began, gradually, to give way to something more integrated. The movements, once deliberate and segmented, started to connect, forming a sequence that required less conscious effort to maintain. She could feel, in certain moments, the alignment Claire had spoken of, the point at which thought did not precede action but moved alongside it. And yet, with this progress came a new awareness. The limitations did not disappear. If anything, they became more defined. She noticed the slight delay in her reactions, the way her body required a fraction of a second longer to respond to changes in balance or speed. She felt the fatigue more acutely, the subtle strain in her muscles after each lesson, the way her hands sometimes trembled slightly when she removed her gloves. These were not obstacles that prevented her from continuing, but they were present, and they required acknowledgement. One afternoon, after a particularly long session, she chose not to drive directly home. Instead, she turned onto a road that led away from town, a stretch of highway she had not traveled in some time. The road was nearly empty. It extended in a long, unbroken line, bordered by fields that had begun to shift from brown to green, the change gradual but unmistakable. The sky was clear, the light sharp, and for a moment Margaret found herself imagining, not with the tentative curiosity of before, but with a more immediate clarity, what it would feel like to move through this space on a motorcycle, not slowly, not within the controlled environment of the training grounds, but fully. The thought carried with it a different quality now. It was no longer abstract. It had weight. She slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. The engine idled, its steady hum filling the interior with a sound that felt, in that moment, insufficient. She turned it off. The silence that followed was not complete. There were distant sounds, the faint movement of wind through the fields, the occasional passing of a car far enough away that it registered more as a suggestion than a presence. Margaret stepped out. The air was warmer than she expected, carrying with it the scent of earth and something faintly sweet, perhaps from the early growth in the fields. She stood by the side of the road, her gaze following the line of it, as it disappeared into the distance. Time, she thought, did not move like this. It did not extend in a visible line, offering the illusion of direction and continuity. It moved differently, less predictably. And yet, here she was, standing at a point in her life she had not anticipated, considering a path she had once dismissed without fully understanding why. She thought of Daniel's letter. Some people don't let themselves keep that. The words had settled into her, not as a directive, but as a kind of quiet challenge. What did it mean to keep something? Was it a matter of action, of memory, or of something less tangible, something that existed in the space between what had been experienced and what was allowed to remain? A car passed, its movement brief, its presence already receding. Margaret remained where she was. For the first time since she had begun the lessons, she allowed herself to consider not only the process, but the possibility of continuation beyond it, not as an extension of what she was learning, but as something separate, a journey. The word, once formed, did not feel grand or excessive. It felt simple, and in that simplicity, it carried a weight she could not ignore. She stood there for a long time, the road before her, the past behind her, and something, undefined but present, between them. It was not until the following week that Margaret told anyone about the letter. She had not intended to keep it to herself for long, and yet, once discovered, it seemed to require a period of quiet consideration, time enough for its meaning to settle into her understanding without the interference of immediate interpretation. It was not the fact of Daniel's words that unsettled her, but the way they rearranged something she had believed to be fixed. She chose to tell Ruth. The decision came not from preference, but from a sense, difficult to articulate, that Ruth would receive the information without imposing upon it a shape it did not yet possess. They sat as they had before, at the kitchen table in Ruth's house, the afternoon light filtering through the window in a pattern that shifted subtly as the sun moved lower in the sky. The bread on the counter had been replaced by a bowl of apples, their skins reflecting the light in small, muted glints. "I found something else," Margaret said, her voice steady, though she felt, beneath it, a faint tension. Ruth looked up. "In the boxes?" "Yes." Margaret placed the letter on the table between them, smoothing it lightly with her hand, as though the gesture might clarify something that remained indistinct. "It's from him," she said. Ruth did not need clarification. She picked up the letter, her movements unhurried, and read it in silence. Her expression did not change, though Margaret sensed in the slight narrowing of her eyes a concentration that went beyond the words themselves. When she finished, she set the letter down. "Well?" she said. Margaret waited. "He remembered it," Ruth added. Yes, there was a pause. "And you didn't," Ruth said. Margaret considered this. "I remembered the ride," she said, "but not this." Ruth nodded as though the distinction was sufficient. They sat in silence for a moment, the letter resting between them like an object that had been placed there not for examination, but for acknowledgement. "Did Thomas know?" Ruth asked. The question was quiet, but it carried a weight that Margaret felt immediately. "I don't think so," she said. Ruth's gaze remained steady. "You never told him?" Margaret shook her head. "No." There was no accusation in Ruth's expression, no suggestion that the omission required justification. And yet, the question itself lingered, opening a space Margaret had not previously considered. Why had she not told him? At the time, it had not felt like a secret. It had been rather something that did not seem relevant to the life she was building. A brief moment that did not, in her understanding, require integration into the narrative she had chosen. Now she was less certain. "It didn't seem important," she said, though even as she spoke, she recognized the inadequacy of the explanation. Ruth did not respond immediately. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the things that don't seem important are the ones we don't know what to do with." Margaret felt at this a subtle shift, not a resolution but an opening. She thought of Thomas then, not as he had been in the later years of his life, but as he had been at the beginning, measured, attentive, offering a steadiness that had felt at the time both reassuring and sufficient. Had there been space within that life for something like this? She could not say. "I've been thinking about him differently," she said. Ruth's expression softened slightly. "In what way?" Margaret hesitated. "I used to think," she began, then paused, adjusting the words as they formed. "I used to think that we chose each other because it was right, because it made sense." Ruth nodded, encouraging but not directing. "And now?" she asked. Margaret looked at the letter. "I think," she said slowly, "that we chose each other because it was easier." The word settled into the room with a quiet finality. Ruth did not respond immediately. She sat with the statement, her gaze resting not on Margaret, but on a point just beyond her, as though considering something that extended beyond the immediate conversation. "That doesn't mean it wasn't real," she said eventually. Margaret nodded. "I know." And she did. The life she had shared with Thomas had not been false. It had been lived, fully and consistently, within the boundaries they had both accepted. There had been care, and a form of love that did not require constant articulation to exist. But now, as she allowed herself to see it from a different angle, she recognized that those boundaries had not been inevitable. They had been chosen, or perhaps more accurately, they had not been questioned. The distinction, though subtle, carried with it a weight she could not ignore. "Are you sorry?" Ruth asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. "No," she said, and after a moment, "But I think I'm aware. Ruth nodded as though this answer was sufficient. They did not speak of it further, but as Margaret drove home later that afternoon, the letter resting on the seat beside her, she felt that something had shifted, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that allowed it to be seen more clearly, not as a fixed narrative, but as a series of choices, each one shaping the next in ways she had not, until now, fully understood. The lessons grew longer, not in duration, but in depth. Margaret found that the initial stages, learning to balance, to control the throttle, to navigate the basic patterns, had given way to something more complex, something that required not only skill, but a different kind of attention. Claire introduced new elements gradually, each one building upon what had come before. There were turns at higher speeds, adjustments in response to uneven surfaces, the subtle coordination required to shift gears smoothly without disrupting the movement of the motorcycle. Margaret approached each new challenge with the same quiet determination she had brought to the beginning, though she was increasingly aware of the limits within which she operated. Her body responded, but not without resistance. There were moments when her hands did not move as quickly as she intended, when her balance faltered in ways that required immediate correction, when the effort of maintaining control left her more fatigued than she was willing to admit. And yet, she continued, it was not, she realized, because she believed she would overcome these limitations entirely. It was because the act of engaging with them, of meeting them directly, without avoidance, carried its own significance. One afternoon, as the lesson drew to a close, Claire approached her with a different expression than usual, not concern, not instruction, but something closer to inquiry. "You've been thinking about taking it further," she said. It was not a question. Margaret removed her helmet, the air cool against her skin. "Yes," she said. Claire nodded. "Out on the road," she said. "Not just here." Margaret felt at the words a subtle tightening, not of doubt exactly, but of recognition. "Yes." Claire studied her for a moment. "It's different," she said. Margaret waited. "There's more to account for," Claire continued. "Other drivers, unpredictable conditions. You don't control the environment the way you do here." Margaret nodded. "I understand." Claire's gaze remained steady. "And you still want to try?" It was, again, not a question. Margaret hesitated, not because she was uncertain, but because she was aware that the answer, once spoken, would carry with it a weight that could not be easily set aside. "Yes," she said. Claire considered this. "All right," she said. "Then we'll start preparing for that." The words were simple, but they marked a shift from learning to application. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself moving through her routine with a heightened awareness, not only of what she was doing, but of what lay ahead. The idea of the road, of leaving the controlled space of the training grounds and entering a landscape that was not structured around her learning, began to take on a more defined presence in her thoughts. It was no longer an abstract possibility. It was approaching. One evening, as she sat in the living room, the photograph and the letter placed side by side on the desk, she allowed herself to consider, fully and without reservation, what she was attempting. Not to recreate the past. That, she understood now, was neither possible nor desirable. The memory she carried was not something that could be returned to in its original form. It existed as it had been, fixed, contained within the context of a different time, a different version of herself. What she was doing now was something else, not a return, but a continuation. And yet, with this understanding came a quieter, more difficult realization. The feeling she had associated with that memory, the sense of openness, of unmediated presence, was not guaranteed. It had appeared then, under circumstances she had not controlled, at a time when she had not yet learned to anticipate or manage its absence. Now she was approaching it differently, with intention, with awareness, and with the knowledge that it might not be there. She sat with this thought for a long time. Outside, the light shifted gradually, the room moving from the soft clarity of late afternoon into the deeper tones of evening. The shadows lengthened, the edges of objects becoming less distinct, as though the space itself were retreating slightly from definition. Margaret did not turn on the lamp. She remained where she was, the photograph and the letter before her, the past and the present, aligned in a way that felt neither resolved nor conflicted, but simply present. After a while she rose and walked to the window. The street was quiet. The houses settled into their familiar stillness, their windows reflecting the fading light. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, she heard it again, the sound of a motorcycle. This time she did not remain still. She opened the door and stepped outside, the air cool against her skin, the sound growing slightly louder before it passed, moving through the street with a brief, contained intensity. She watched until it disappeared, and then, after a moment, she returned inside, not to sit, but to prepare. The morning she chose to ride alone did not announce itself as extraordinary. It arrived with the same quiet progression as other mornings, light filtering gradually through the curtains, the faint creak of the house settling, the distant movement of a car along the street. And yet, from the moment Margaret opened her eyes, she felt a difference, not in the world around her, but in the way she occupied it. She did not linger at the kitchen table. The routines that had once structured her morning seemed, on this day, less necessary, as though they belonged to a rhythm she had already, in some subtle way, stepped beyond. She moved through the house with a deliberate calm, her actions measured but without hesitation. The helmet rested on the chair where she had placed it the night before. Beside it, the keys. She stood for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, her gaze moving between the objects as though confirming their presence, their reality. This, she understood, was not a continuation of the lessons. It was something else. Outside, the air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of early spring, earth, moisture, the subtle suggestion of growth not yet visible. The sky was clear, the light still soft, not yet sharpened by the full presence of the day. The motorcycle stood in the driveway. It was not new. Claire had arranged for her to borrow it, a smaller machine, manageable, its surfaces marked by use rather than display. Margaret approached it slowly, aware of the quiet of the street, of the houses still holding their early morning stillness. She placed her hand on the seat. The gesture, familiar now, no longer carried the same uncertainty it once had, and yet, beneath that familiarity, There was something else, a recognition of the step she was about to take, of the movement from one state into another. She mounted the motorcycle. The position settled around her more easily than it had before, her body finding its place with a memory that was no longer entirely new. She adjusted her feet, her hands, her posture, each movement deliberate, each one aligning with something she had practiced, repeated, learned. The engine started. The vibration moved through her, steady, insistent, not startling now, but present in a way that could not be ignored. For a moment, she did not move. She sat there, the machine beneath her, the street before her, the house behind her, and allowed herself to feel the convergence of all that had led to this point, not as a sequence of events, but as a single, continuous motion that had brought her here. Then slowly, she released the brake. The motorcycle moved. The first stretch of the ride was cautious. She remained within the neighborhood, the streets familiar, their turns predictable, their surfaces known. The houses passed at a measured pace, their presence both grounding and slightly confining, as though they belonged to a world she was, in this moment, beginning to leave. Her attention was focused, precise. The movements she had practiced, accelerating, braking, turning, unfolded in sequence, each one requiring her awareness, her participation. There was no space for distraction, no room for thought that extended beyond the immediate. And yet, beneath this concentration, something else began to emerge. Not the memory she had carried, not the feeling she had expected, but something quieter, a clarity. She turned onto a larger road, the transition marked not by any visible boundary, but by a subtle shift in the flow of movement, the presence of other vehicles, the widening of space. Her heart beat faster. The stakes, she realized, had changed. Here, she was no longer alone in a controlled environment. The road extended beyond her, unpredictable, shared. She adjusted her speed, her position, her awareness expanding to include not only her own movement, but the movements of others, the car approaching from behind, the truck in the opposite lane, the slight variations in the surface beneath her tires. The wind pressed against her. It was not as she remembered. It was stronger, more insistent, carrying with it a resistance that required her to respond, to hold her position, to maintain her balance with a firmness she had not anticipated. The road stretched ahead. For a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible moment, she felt it, not as it had been, not as a sudden, overwhelming sense of freedom, but as something more complex, a simultaneous awareness of movement and limitation, of openness and constraint, of presence and vulnerability. It did not lift her. It grounded her. She continued. The miles passed, though she did not measure them. The landscape shifted gradually, houses giving way to fields, the road opening into longer stretches, the horizon becoming more defined. And with each passing moment, the initial tension did not disappear, but it changed, became part of the experience, integrated. She was aware of her body, of the slight strain in her arms, the focus required to maintain her line, the constant adjustments that kept her aligned with the movement of the motorcycle. She was aware of time, not as something abstract, but as something present in her reactions, in the way her body responded, in the limits that did not recede, and she was aware, perhaps most of all, of the absence of what she had once believed she would find. The memory had carried with it a promise. This did not fulfill it. It replaced it with something quieter, more exacting, more real. At a certain point, she could not say precisely when, she felt the shift, not in the road, not in the machine, but in herself, a recognition. She could continue. The road extended, the possibility remained, but she could also stop, not as a failure, not as an end, but as a choice. She slowed. The motorcycle responded, the deceleration smooth, controlled. She guided it to the side of the road, bringing it to a stop with a precision that would have been impossible only weeks before. The engine idled. Then, with a small movement, she turned it off. The silence that followed was immediate, complete. Margaret remained seated for a moment, her hands still on the handlebars, her body adjusting to the absence of vibration, of motion. Then she removed her helmet. The air touched her face, cool, unfiltered. She looked out at the landscape, the fields, the road, the distant line of trees marking the horizon. She had reached something, not a destination, a limit, and in that limit there was no disappointment, only understanding. When Margaret returned home, the house received her without change, the same quiet, the same arrangement of objects, the same light moving through the rooms in its familiar patterns. And yet, as she stepped inside, removing her jacket, placing the helmet once more on the chair, she felt that something within her had shifted in a way that did not require external confirmation. She moved through the rooms slowly, not out of fatigue, though her body carried the subtle signs of exertion, but out of a kind of attentiveness that had not been present before. In the living room, the photograph and the letter remained where she had left them. She approached the desk and stood before them, her gaze moving from one to the other, not comparing, not evaluating, but simply acknowledging their presence. The past, she understood now, was not something that could be revisited in the way she had once imagined. It could not be re-entered. It could only be re-seen. She picked up the photograph. The young woman on the motorcycle remained as she had been, unchanged, fixed within the moment that had defined her. The road stretched behind her, the movement implied but not experienced. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she set the photograph down and picked up the letter. You felt it too. She had. But she had not known what to do with it. Now she did. Not in the sense of action, of continuation, of pursuing something that could not be sustained, but in the sense of recognition, of allowing it to exist as part of her life, not as an interruption, not as an alternative path left unexplored, but as something that had been real, even if it had not been continued. She placed the letter beside the photograph. Together they formed not a contradiction but a continuity. Later that evening she called Judith. I went out on the road, she said. There was a pause. Alone? Judith asked. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. And? Judith said. Margaret considered the question. It was different than I thought, she said. Judith did not respond immediately. In what way? She asked. Margaret searched for the words, aware that whatever she said would not fully convey the experience, but would have to suffice. It wasn't about the speed, she said. or the feeling I remembered? Judith waited. It was about knowing when to stop. There was a silence on the line, not empty, but filled with something Margaret could not entirely name. "I see," Judith said. Margaret was not sure that she did, but that did not matter. The following day, Ruth came to visit. They sat, as they often did, in the living room, the afternoon light softening the edges of the room. "You did it," Ruth said. Margaret nodded. "Yes." "And?" Margaret smiled slightly. "I stopped." Ruth regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds right," she said. Margaret felt at this a quiet sense of alignment, not with Ruth's words, but with the understanding they reflected. They spoke of other things after that, though the conversation carried, beneath its surface, a shared awareness of something that did not require further explanation. That evening, as Margaret stood at the window, the street outside settling into its familiar stillness, she realized that the question that had once occupied her thoughts had changed. It was no longer, "What if I had chosen differently?" It had become something else, something quieter. "What have I chosen now?" In the weeks that followed, Margaret did not return to the training grounds. This, at first, seemed to her like a decision that might require justification, as though the absence of continuation needed to be explained, even if only to herself. But as the days unfolded, she found that no such explanation was necessary. The lessons had not ended abruptly, nor had they been abandoned. They had instead reached a point beyond which continuation would not have altered their meaning. She did not, however, return entirely to the life she had known before. Something had shifted, not in the structure of her days, which remained in many ways the same, but in the way she moved within them. There was a subtle difference in her attention, a willingness to remain with moments rather than pass through them, a quiet recognition of their presence that had not, until recently, been fully accessible to her. The photograph and the letter remained on the desk. She did not put them away. They existed now not as remnants of something unresolved, but as parts of a narrative she no longer felt compelled to complete in any particular way. One afternoon she drove to the edge of town, to the gas station where she had first spoken with Walter. The place was much as she remembered, the same faded signage, the same arrangement of pumps, the same quiet presence of the surrounding fields. A motorcycle stood near the edge of the lot, though she did not recognize it as the one she had seen before. Walter was there. He stood near the entrance, his posture unchanged, as though he had remained in place while the rest of the world moved around him. "Margaret," he said, as she approached. "Walter." He looked at her for a moment, his gaze steady, attentive. "You tried it," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," he nodded. "And?" Margaret considered her answer. "I understand it better now," she said. Walter's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise but in acknowledgement. "That's usually what happens," he said. There was a pause. "You going to keep riding?" he asked. Margaret looked past him, toward the road that extended beyond the station, its line stretching into the distance. "No," she said. Walter did not react immediately. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." There was no disappointment in his voice, no suggestion that she had failed to follow through on something expected. It was, simply, an acceptance. They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the place settling around them. "You got what you needed?" he asked. Margaret thought of the ride, of the road, of the moment she had chosen to stop. "Yes," she said. Walter inclined his head slightly. "Then that's that," he said. Margaret smiled, though the expression was small, almost imperceptible. "Yes," she said, "that's that." She did not stay long. As she drove away, the road unfolding before her in its familiar sequence, she felt no urge to extend the journey beyond what it was. The distance held no particular promise, no unfulfilled expectation. It was simply there. That evening, as the light began to fade, she walked through the house, pausing in each room not out of habit, but out of a quiet attentiveness that had become, in recent days, more natural to her. In the bedroom, she opened the closet. The boxes remained, though fewer now, their contents gradually sorted, integrated, or released. She reached for one of the remaining items, a coat that had belonged to Thomas, its fabric still carrying faintly the scent she associated with him. She held it for a moment, then returned it to its place. There was no need to decide anything about it. Not yet. In the living room, she turned on the lamp. The light settled into the space, soft, steady, illuminating the desk where the photograph and the letter lay side by side. She sat. Outside, the street grew quiet, the houses dimming as the evening deepened. For a while she did nothing. She did not reach for the photograph, nor for the letter. She did not attempt to draw conclusions, to define what had changed, to assign meaning where it was not yet fully formed. She simply sat, and in that stillness she felt something she had not anticipated. Not a resolution, not a sense of completion, but a quiet openness, a space within herself that did not demand to be filled. The past remained. The choices she had made, the life she had lived, the moments she had set aside or allowed to pass, all of it existed not as a burden, but as a presence. And alongside it, now, there was something else. Not a new path, not a different life, but a different way of being within the one she had. Later, as she prepared for bed, she paused at the window. The night had settled fully, the street lit only by the soft glow of the lamps, their light pooling gently on the pavement. For a moment, she thought she heard it again, the distant sound of a motorcycle, faint, almost indistinct. But this time she did not turn toward it. She did not follow it with her thoughts. She let it pass, and in doing so, she understood, not as an idea but as a quiet, settled awareness, that freedom was not something she had missed, nor was it something she had found. It was something she had at last allowed.